you everyone for coming to this evening's event. 大家晚上好. And today's event is the 6th event of the Transnational and Situated Seminar Series at 上海交通 University School of Humanities. My name is Flair 东来师，我是施东来，现任教于上海交通大学人文学院。And this seminar series has been organized by me to promote free research sharing. That's one of the good legacies of the pandemic years. And each time we invite professors from around the world to share their cutting-edge research with us. And today we're very honored to have invited two excellent professors from two different universities to share with us their latest research in the humanities, especially on the topic on aging. So the overall title we have for this event is With the Posthuman, Narratives of Aging in the Gerontocene. There are lots of big concepts here, but I hope through tonight's event, we will unpack them in due time. So the format of the event will be for the first half, both speakers will talk for around half an hour each, and then we will have some time for Q&A. The Q&A part will not be recorded. So because Graham Riach unfortunately cannot join us in real time, so he recorded his talk beforehand, and I will now go ahead and introduce him, and then I will play the recording. I myself have already read the short story he shared with us, and I can participate in some discussions if some of you guys have questions about that part. Yes, so Graham Riach is a lecturer in the English literature department at the University of Amsterdam. His research focuses on contemporary word literature with interest in form, genre, and the intersection of literature and aging. His most recent book, The Short Story After Apartheid, Thinking with Form in South African Literature, was published in 2023. And this is his ongoing big project on aging and word literature. So I will now share screen and let's see if it works. Okay. I hope you can hear the sound as well.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone all over the world. It's not very often that I get to say that, but here we are. And thank you very much for taking the time to attend this talk. Thanks in particular to Flair for the invitation to speak at this wonderful series. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today, and I'm sending a recording instead. Today, I'm going to start by introducing a project that I've been working on recently, which will, I hope, will establish the usefulness of aging as an analytical category for thinking about world literature. Along the way, I'll illustrate my points with various shorter examples, and towards the end, I'll go into a bit more detail about one text in particular, a short story called The Rememberers by Singaporean author Rachel Heng. First though, a few words on how I came to this current research. A few years ago, I wrote an article on Nadine Gordimer's late style, and this led me to a number of questions. Why was it, I wondered, that criticism had awarded a late style to J.M. Coetzee, but not to her? What role, I wondered, did getting old play in how Gordimer thought about her own work, and perhaps how it was received? And what happens when a politically informed author like Gordimer outlives the regime that they wrote against? Gordimer was born before the start of apartheid in South Africa, lived all the way through it and wrote against it, but continued to live for quite some time after its end. So the object of her political critique was in its original form no longer there. So I got interested in these questions of long life, old age, and how they might influence questions around literature and its reception. These questions led me to my current project, which is called Global Narratives of Aging. I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on this work. Please do feel free to contact me via the email you saw on the first slide, or you'll find me under my name, Graham Riach, on the University of Amsterdam website. This project looks at the conjunction between world literature and going old. It's basically grounded in literary studies, but it will involve some collaborative work with colleagues in, for example, anthropology, sociology, and gerontology as well, to understand how aging is represented and what role aging might play in authors' lives, and indeed the role of art in our lives as we age. Biological aging, of course, happens to us all, whether we like it or not. We're all aging right now. But of course, cultural attitudes to getting old vary enormously. In the words of one critic, Margaret Gullette, we are aged by culture. In other words, biological aging is inevitable, but what it means to age depends on the society in which it happens. How then has aging been represented, and what might we learn from those representations? How has aging influenced the production and reception of literature and other forms of art? Does aging perhaps pose particular challenges to representation? And if so, how have different aesthetic traditions responded to that challenge? There are, of course, lots of examples of aging in world literature, from Chinua Achebe's aging patriarch Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart, to Bernardine Evaristo's Mr. Loverman, a 74-year-old gay Caribbean man in London. The more I research, the more I find myself surprised that aging has received so little attention in world literary studies. There's lots of stuff on class and race and gender and so on, sexuality, all these kinds of things, but there's not really very much on aging at all. And yet, if a society's attitudes shape what it means to age, then different cultural contexts and different aesthetic traditions, I think, will give different conclusions. So it seems to me it really is worth thinking in terms of aging when it comes to post-colonial and world literary texts. Simone de Beauvoir, in her study The Coming of Age, writes, "Old age is particularly difficult to assume because we have always regarded it as something alien, a foreign species. As a foreign identity that we grow into, aging complicates distinctions between what is native and what is foreign. World literature, of course, is deeply concerned with our place in the world in relation to others, and to reflect on aging reveals both perhaps our foreignness to ourselves and maybe that the models we have for understanding foreignness might be in some way lacking. Aging, I think, also presents a representational problem. Similar to the difficulties posed by the slow violence of climate change, the term is from Rob Nixon, of course. Aging is also an accretive process that's resistant to representation, except in its eventual effects. It's very difficult to represent aging as it happens, in the same way it's very difficult to represent a changing climate as it happens. Most depictions of aging that we find fall into two camps. One camp shows old age as a funny, nostalgic adventure, with comedy the most common genre. Here I'm thinking about TV programmes like Last of the Summer Wine, which you can see on the screen there. I'm not sure if that ever made it to America or to China, but in Britain it was a very popular programme during the 80s and 90s that had kind of comic adventures of the three old men that you see in this picture. Or, you know, you also have something like a novel. The title, I think, was The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared, is another example of this comic mode. One critic calls this genre old people behaving hilariously, and this occupies one end of the spectrum of representing old age. At the other extreme, though, are the chilling pictures of psychological and cognitive decline, which another critic called old people behaving terrifyingly. One example of this, albeit quite a complicated one, is Niwa Fumio's 1947 Yagarase no Nenrei, which was translated as The Hateful Age. In the text, 86-year-old Ube is constantly hungry, difficult, and seems to perform human emotions like a puppet or marionette. Here on the slide is how the narrator describes a scene when two daughters are looking at their mothers. From their expressions, it was clear that they did not feel they were looking at human beings at all, but rather at some strange species of superannuated plant or animal. With a little more imagination, they might have regarded these two octogenarians not as members of some grotesque genus, but as living warnings that they themselves would become old and useless, bereft of all joy of living, and with only death to look forward to. While the beginning of the story sets up these aging women as the story's antagonists, it becomes clear over the course of the story that the true antagonist of the story is time itself. And the deeper terror of this story is the thin, meagre choice between dying early and being treated as less than human as we grow old. The central aim of this project is to explore the rich seam of literature and other artworks that complicate simplistic models of aging as either funny or terrifying, and that foreground how aging troubles representation. Rather than judging aging to be successful or unsuccessful by any single model, I rather try to understand it as a significant, hugely varied part of life that is mediated through a wide range of representational forms. First, let me say something on the role of genre in depictions of aging. Aging can be represented through many forms and modes: comedy, tragedy, irony, realism, and so on, and these shape our perception of aging. One striking example of this can be found in Yael Farber's play Molora. This play is a radical adaptation of the Oresteia trilogy, which relocates the Greek tragedy to South Africa at a Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearing. The play explores the pull between retribution and restoration, and the ethics of presenting both victim and perpetrator testimonies. What drew my attention for this project, though, was the chorus of aging Xhosa women on the stage. The first line of the play, as the chorus sets up, is sung in Xhosa. Hona pali gazi, blood has been spilt. And their choric interventions offer music and song and praise the communal ancestors. In classical tragedy, the chorus of the elderly is often used to imply a way of thinking that's become outdated in the present, or it might provide sympathy for those in need, but its members are too frail to offer concrete help. But do these models of understanding the elderly chorus taken from Greek drama hold in a South African context? The presence of the elders on stage here performs a very interesting function. Their physical presence embodies a traditional cultural framework, a site of memory, and a challenge to any idea of a fresh new start at the beginning of the post-apartheid period. In a theatre production in particular, we're reminded of the tension between aging as a social construct and the importance of actual bodies in situating empirical actors in a material environment. What does the reconciliatory justice of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission mean to these women who have spent their lives under apartheid? And what can justice look like for a structural state crime that marked these aging bodies? What interests me so much in this depiction is that it draws on the workings of genre, creating a chain of reference to tragedy and to aging figures on the stage. But more than this, it actively reconfigures or disrupts that genre by pulling its concerns into the ambit of a culture in which both age and justice operate differently. The questions of judgment, catharsis, retribution, and reconciliation that are so central to Greek tragedy take on a very different meaning when, as in Xhosa culture, the structure of reconciliation prohibits forgetting the past. In fact, reconciliation relies on repeated cycles of witnessing, with the ancestors immediately present as part of the community and the elders their closest link. The presence of older people on the stage is integral to the logic of this transposed tragedy, and their living on in the present complicates the societal catharsis promised by apartheid's end. I'll give you a brief glimpse of another part of the project before moving on to the longer close reading. This part of the project looks at the aesthetics of care, and some of the most ethically fraught issues, I would say, around ageing involve the care of older people. For both carers and those cared for, there's a complex interplay of the needs and desires of duty and love. An amazing example of this kind of relationship is depicted in this film by Japanese director Naoko Nobumoto. The film, the Japanese title is Bokemasu kara yoroshiku onegai shimasu, which was translated as I Go Gaga, My Dear. It's a documentary chronicling the director's experience with her aging parents as her mother's Alzheimer's-related dementia gradually worsens. There are lots of close shots of faces like this one, which use the face-to-face encounter to elicit a difficult kind of reciprocity between the viewer and the subjects of the documentary. The film blends quite graphic documentation of her mother's condition with moments of pathos, sentimentality, even comedy, creating quite unstable affective states in the viewer. The film's really interesting when it's examining the gender dynamics of care relationships in Japan, and the similarities between care ethics and Confucian ethics, in which relationship is fundamental to being. I'm currently working on how the director creates a relational pool of closeness and distance between the viewer and the film, which interacts with and complicates the care relationships that her film depicts. In the time that I have left, let me turn to a slightly more in-depth reading of Rachel Heng's short story, The Rememberers. This came out in McSweeney's Quarterly in 2019. It was a kind of special issue called 2040 AD, where they had paired up authors with climate scientists to write a series of climate fictions. They kind of did it in dialogue between the sciences and the humanities, and this was Rachel Heng's contribution to that collection. The story takes place in a 2040s Singapore transformed by rising sea levels. The city of Singapore is now surrounded by a high wall which keeps the flood water out. This setup causes quite limited space conditions, and this means that much of the population is now housed in residential bunkers deep below the ground. They're kind of like, they're described as inverted skyscrapers that go 30 or 40 floors deep below the ground. There are a few wealthy people who live in houses on the surface, and then there are the others, the outcasts, who live outside the wall. In the story, we see a daughter, who's the narrator of the story, and she cares for Ma, her aging mother, who has Alzheimer's disease. In the story, the government recruits older Singaporeans to tell stories from their youth in a time before the floods. They want to find out things like where the buildings were and what they looked like, what did people do in their daily life. And during these remembering sessions, the participants put on a kind of helmet with wires attached to it. It's a government-designed machine that makes the memories appear more immersive and vivid. And while allowing the participants a kind of enhanced version of their memory, the machine also harvests those memories, and the data gets uploaded and fed into a machine learning algorithm. Now, by doing this, the government hopes to harness the power of AI to find some solution to the climate crisis. Here's how the story describes it. The idea was simple. Climate change being too big a problem for the human mind to solve, too complex and multivariate for scientists or politicians to grapple with, the thinking went. Salvation could come only from the mind of a machine. Memories were gathered from those who could still recall the world as it once was, offered as data points to the program, God of algorithms. All the data was valuable, all of it. What our limited human minds saw as insignificant could possess great meaning. Answers found in that which our flawed and mortal souls could only perceive as randomness. So environmental catastrophe is here shown a bit like some theories of the sublime to exceed the human mind's ability to capture it. But here, rather than reason triumphing over the infinite, as Immanuel Kant would have it, it's machine learning that can best conceive of this kind of scale and detail. These remembering sessions are very important to Ma. They calm her down as she struggles with her failing memory. But somewhere around halfway through the story, the ministry unexpectedly removes Ma from the remembering program, She's no longer entitled to go and have these remembering sessions. And as a result, she becomes destructive. She smashes up her daughter's house, which she's left alone inside. So it seems that the extraction of data has damaging consequences for those that remember, and much like the extraction of natural resources has been catastrophic for the people living in the world. In an attempt to help her mother, the daughter makes a replica version of the remembering machine. She buys a second-hand bike helmet and electrical wires. And here I was very grateful to the internet. I just typed in bicycle helmet, electrical wires, and for somebody had already made one that looks exactly like the kind there was in the story. Incredible times. Inevitably, though, this crude simulation falls flat, as this contraption can't plunge Ma into her memories in the same way the real helmet can. In desperation, the narrator goes to the remembering centre and threatens the receptionist by pressing a shard of broken TV screen to the woman's wrist, trying to regain access to the machine. And this is how the story ends, with the narrator pressing the glass against the receptionist's pulse. This story, The Rememberers, explores the challenges of narrating two fraught contexts, that of depicting Alzheimer's and that of climate change. While these two phenomena might feel like they don't have so much to do with one another, in fact, there's quite a lot of overlap between the two. Firstly, the growing percentage of old people in society is often described through climate metaphors. The old come as a tsunami or as a flood. As the critic Jacob Jewusiak notes, these climate metaphors gain force because of a belief that our current climate crisis is the result of the depredations of previous generations. More immediately, though, both climate change and dementia pose representational challenges. Noting the friction between narrative and climate change, Ursula Heiser writes, "Climate change poses a challenge for narrative and lyrical forms that have conventionally focused above all on individuals, families, or nations, since it requires the articulation of connections between events of vastly different scales." Literature depicting dementia faces a kind of similar problem. Here's Jacob Jewusiak again, who notes that dementia literature often situates the disease as a challenge to the formal coherence of the self, a backsliding into formlessness, fragmentation, and loss. And so it represents an overlapping challenge to narrating the self in literary form. The narrative acts of this story are, on the one hand, attempts to capture the slow violence of climate change through individuated stories, but on the other, they interrogate the narrative aspects of how we construct versions of ourselves, and what happens when these are disturbed by the cognitive impairment that often accompanies aging. The story proposes, I suggest, a number of prosthetic forms of memory that illuminate our understanding of intergenerational memory, the climate catastrophe, and the mnemotechnologies of literary form. The temporal ruptures in how this story is told, combined with Ma's destabilization as her ability to narrate herself fails, work in tandem with the struggle to represent the Anthropocene, the scale of which seems to defy human perception and understanding. As Ma's memory fails, her remembering sessions become storytelling acts that hold her sense of self together. At first, the sessions go well, with her acts of remembering leading to her being awarded a certificate for extraordinary contributions. These sessions give Ma some stability, so when they're abruptly brought to an end, and she's faced with a changed present around her, she becomes violent and distressed. She damages the contents of the apartment, saying, "How come here got no windows? What happened to our flat? I thought I was dying." Like nightmare like that. Now that's one other thing perhaps to say about the story. When Ma, the mother, speaks, she speaks in a kind of version of Singlish, Singaporean English, which she has to speak because her daughter can't speak Hokkien, like the mother can. The daughter has kind of left and gone and lived abroad. So there's a kind of linguistic question at play as well, but I won't go into that now. Ma's failing memory provides a model for how we experience the world in a state of climate crisis. when what we know is rapidly vanishing, leaving us disoriented and confused. This estrangement of time in the rememberers is here visible in Ma's shock that the present she occupies is discontinuous with the version of herself she narrates. These narrative discontinuities are not only present in Ma's acts of remembrance, they also structure the way that the story is narrated. The story shuttles between past and present, providing a kind of narrative mimesis of Ma's remembering sessions. The disjunction between the narrative present and past times is emphasized through references to before. On the one hand, this refers to a time before environmental changes reshaped the world of the story, before, in a different time, before the water and the power cuts and the blazing, scorching heat. But on the other hand, it equally distinguishes between her mother, as she currently is, and how she was, before the illness got bad, before the bunker, after the water, before forgets. Time seems stuck between the times of before and after, discrete worlds separated into their pre-flood and post-flood forms. A critic called Zoltán Baldassar Simon writes this very interesting passage. The extent to which the Anthropocene resists processual narratives on all scales is the extent to which it defies the continuity of human experience. Instead of unfolding from past states of affairs, such a change brings about a disconnection between past states of affairs and a completely novel predicament by a suddenly erupting game-changer event. The question is how to reconcile this with our storytelling activity in which we manifest the continuity of our experience. So he's kind of saying, yeah, that the kind of developmental or causal narrative through which we usually tell stories, and particularly stories of ourselves, come under great pressure in the context of the Anthropocene, because suddenly that continuity of human experience is put under great pressure. And similarly, I think in this story, Rachel Heng asks how this can be thought together with memory loss, searching for a way to narrate once the kind of storytelling that depends on the continuity of experience, even you might say constructs the continuity of experience, is no longer possible. In the Rememberers, the two crises of the rising tide and her mother's dementia impede the narrator's attempts to align the before of memory with the after in which she lives. These gaps in narrative continuity add texture to the problem Simon outlines. How can we tell stories in contexts where the continuity of experience has been eroded? The Rememberers explores modes of narration that might be fit for the depiction of both the Anthropocene and Alzheimer's. For Heng, at least, these factors seem to trouble the very possibility of coherent selfhood and self-narration. Perhaps, though, there's also a way that this story not only critiques the prosthetic memory that Ma finds in the remembering machine, but also models another form of memorial prosthesis in the form of a work of art. Jonathan Hope and Michael Whitmore argue that writing itself is a prosthetic. It allows us to overcome the physical limitations of the medium of speech and psychological constraints of linguistic processing. A story like The Rememberers implicitly positions itself as one component in a process of remembering, a prosthetic cultural memory of how things were, or at least how the world was once imagined. So as well as having this memory function, artworks, I think, offer a different kind of prosthesis too. This kind is not a prosthesis to memory, like the remembering machine's clouded memories, these memories that are uploaded to the cloud, but it's rather a prosthesis that mediates the world. Here I'm thinking of prostheses that alter the way we experience the world, something like a pair of glasses, like the pair that I'm wearing now, or a hearing aid. They're so common, I suppose, glasses and hearing aids, that we don't think of them so much as a form of prosthesis, but I can tell you that if I don't have my glasses, I very quickly remember that it's a prosthesis that I need quite urgently. So much in the same way as a pair of glasses, works of art frame the world while mediating it, and so can shape our understanding and shape our mode of perception. In other words, artworks don't just represent reality, they also produce reality, or at least they produce our perception of that reality, and so they serve a secondary prosthetic function. The various prostheses this story portrays and, in effect, embodies, I think, can help us understand questions about intergenerational memory, about the climate catastrophe, and about the memorial power of literary form. I'll need to wrap things up now, but I'm looking forward to hearing what you all thought, and of course to hearing Keren He's paper once it's uploaded to the cloud. So please do feel free to get in touch, and thank you very much again for the invitation, Flair.
And yes, let me try to unmute Keren. Yes, I think it's unmuted. Okay, so next, we are very honored to have Professor He Keren from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Keren specializes in modern and contemporary Chinese literature, media, and popular culture, with a focus on age and suicide studies. Her current book manuscript, Anti-Aging in Chinese-Speaking Worlds, advances age as not merely another marginal identity, but a critical analytical category that synergizes crisscrossing social inequalities. So without further ado, let's just welcome Dr. He to give us her part of the talk, and then we can all come back and discuss the ideas shared.
Okay, thank you, Flair. I want to thank you, Dr. Donglai and the School of Humanities at Shanghai Jiaoda for hosting this wonderful event. And I'm particularly thrilled to see such a great turnout for a research talk on aging. Because, you know, every time I give a lecture on aging, students in the US would usually just come for my keywords such as technology, post-humanism, sci-fi, and the Gerontocene. And actually, very few of them would pay attention to the word aging per se. I think it's pretty natural because technology seems to have always represented everything opposite to old age. And perhaps we're just too used to assuming that technology is inherently associated with youth, with novelty and innovation, and with young people's subculture. In fact, in the manga adaptation of Liu Cixin's novella in Japan, the artist just has to invent this little girl, a preteen child, as the leading character, as if it were the only way to make the narrative more appealing. So with my research on old age, I have always tasked myself to illuminate not only the much overlooked intersection between technology and aging, but also revise the perceived equation of youth with futurity. So if we think about the prospect of global population aging, it is not the young people, but actually the growing older demographic that would hover over our future socioeconomic development. Often described as eco-disasters such as civil tsunami and avalanche, global population aging is perceived in alarmist media discourse as another pandemic that threatens socioeconomic viability. But in reality, the older demographic is perhaps the most universally marginalized social group in the contemporary world. And it actually took a global pandemic for people to recognize this kind of marginalization. I'm sure some of you perhaps have heard of this derogatory term, boomer remover in the US, which is generally used by Gen Z to read of the, or to consider the pandemic as a way to rid themselves of the boomer generation once and for all. And I think perhaps some recent discussions in China about the issue of raising retirement age also triggered some kind of intergenerational conflict, although to a much lesser degree. So the marginalization of Chinese old age presents a unique case within this global story. Once privileged in both family and politics, Chinese elders experienced a drastic devaluation alongside the embrace of youth over the 20th century, only to be perceived as a hurdle to China's rise in the new millennium. By 2053, nearly 1/3 of the PRC's immense population will turn 65. And in 2055, every 2 adults will have to shoulder the obligation of supporting one elder through taxes. So this bleak projection points to an impending Gerontocene. I use this term to describe a future phase of demographic development where the aging population is perceived to be the major burden to strain socioeconomic functioning. So I do want to quickly make the caveat that I definitely don't want to use the word Gerontocene as a kind of descriptive or prescriptive term. I use it specifically to refer to the ideology of Gerontocene in which the older population is perceived, and very often wrongfully so, as what would drain public resources at times of population aging. For me, the term itself is always an alarmist misrepresentation of reality, and it does not have much analytical value unless we strictly use it for critique. So please don't quote me in the wrong way. Otherwise, it would be contradicting my original agenda. So how can we address this perceived crisis of the Gerontocene? To this question, both Chinese social policies and Chinese language science fiction offer their own responses. In both areas, interestingly, the promise of automation and robotization, which I refer to as post-human elder care, offers a glimmer of hope. So in my research, I aim to initiate a dialogue between these two perspectives on post-human elder care, one from technocrats and the other from creative writers. Central to my concern is the question, can technology save us from the challenges of the Gerontocene? And if people have already started to say no to this question, and some of you might have read the book, I'd like to push back a little bit by asking, how can we approach technology differently so that it can start to save us? Let's first take a look at the post-human care in the domain of social policies in the PRC. To address the elder care crisis in the face of population aging, the PRC government started to promote the smart elder care system from 2012. It involves a series of policies to subsidize the industry and 2 5-year plans to test run pilot programs in urban areas. Built on the Internet of Things, cloud computing, and machine learning, the smart elder care system presents a scenario that can once only be seen in science fiction. So now, even without the presence of family or caregivers, a Chinese later life can now appear safe and fulfilling. Staying at home equipped by smart devices, we will be safeguarded by millimeter wave radar sensors that vigilantly oversees our postures. When strolling around our neighborhoods, an activity tracker will guide our way home, and a smart vest with airbags will shield our joints when we fall. Daily meals can be tailored to our dietary needs and then delivered to the front door. A smart family doctor can perform basic health checkups, and an exoskeleton suit can enhance our mobility. Then, if we feel lonely, a companion robot can serve as a pet, a conversation partner, or simply turn on our favorite TV shows just at the right time. Sounds very promising, right? When I first visited the elder care industry expo in Shanghai last summer, I had the impression that the PRC was almost on its way to becoming the next retirement destination after, for example, Florida. But of course, the problem is obvious. The quiet omnipresence of the care system in elders' everyday life might immediately evoke the PRC's surveillance datatopia with even a heightened level of intimacy and intensity. And it's not hard for us to flag its potential violation of human rights. I will break down potential objections into 2 points. First of all, it won't be hard for us to argue that post-human technologies tend to render embodied humans invisible. As the smart care system transforms the entirety of elders' existence into information flow, every fabric of elders' daily life is now abstracted and decorporealized into a data double. I recycle this term from Keren He's work on surveillance, and I use it to describe how elders' lives are evaluated and managed only according to algorithmic benchmarks, irrespective of the particularity of their lived experiences. The apprehension regarding such dehumanizing consequences can be best exemplified by a contentious social incident. So I'm sure some of you have heard of this. When an over 90-year-old disabled woman in Hubei province struggled to activate her social welfare card in a local bank, her family basically had to physically lift her to the right position for facial recognition to verify her identity. Ironically, as elders' health rights become a means to technological self-actualization, elder care devolves into technocare. And second, apprehensions regarding technology's dehumanizing effects are particularly pronounced in the critique of humanoid robots. For instance, Sherry Turkle suggests that social robots, like the famous paddle, would radically change not only the nature of human relationship at the center of elder care, but also the very concept of personhood. So she suspects that with the aid of social robots, caregivers might relinquish their capacity to empathize with care recipients. And this capacity is pivotal in establishing the notion of personhood rooted in self-other relationships. Turkle's unease resonates with a comparable critique in China. In liberating children from the traditional duty of tending to their parents, automated technologies are said to have threatened the bedrock of Chinese humanism, which is familial ethics and filial piety. But my own critique of smart elder care takes a very different perspective. For me, the system is problematic not because of its dehumanizing effects, but because it is still way too human. The system can be perhaps described as post-human in the sense that it enables coexistence between elders and machines, but it is by no means a post-humanist elder care. Now I will briefly segue to what I mean by post-humanism first. Admittedly, research about post-humanism frequently revolve around humans' relationship with other life forms, with the environment, and with technologies. In a word, with things that are beyond the human domains. However, as highlighted by the genealogical studies of Rossi Braidotti, the core of critical posthumanism in fact originates from the critique of Western anthropocentrism, which is premised on the archetypal image of white males. And this male image is constructed by othering non-human animals, nature, technology, as well as by othering marginal human groups such as gender, sexual minorities, and people of color. Braidotti has famously said that humanism's restricted notion of what counts as the human is one of the keys to understand how we got to a post-human turn at all. So this is basically one of my favorite quotes from her work. So she's basically saying we won't get the gist of post-humanism unless we get the human issue straight first. So you see, rather than a kind of a technology-imbued field of novelty, critical post-humanism in fact reiterates this kind of unjust distribution of human differences and the dichotomous mindset of humanism. The elders with the presumed erosion of conventional human agency also potentially fall victim to this same bias. From this viewpoint, even if the smart elder care system embraces the human-machine integration on the surface, as long as it still implicitly denigrates elders as subhuman, and as long as it still differentiates elders from what is considered a normative person, then it still commits a humanist fallacy. In my longer essay, I demonstrate two major failures of the system along this line. First of all, the smart elder care implicitly replicates a humanist division between the older population, perceived as the drain on public resources, and the regular working population capable of producing values. For example, the whole system is justified on the account that the former, meaning the older population, can continue to generate value like the latter, like the working population. Here, I examine the PRC's policy incentives surrounding longevity dividend, which views elders as an untapped market resource. I also examine the system as an example of post-human capitalism, which exploits elders as unpaid trainers for machine learning and algorithm refinement in the Chinese data infrastructure. In this light, only when elders are reconfigured as value-making laborers comparable to the working population can their rights to care be actively advocated. So in other words, to become care-worthy, one has to first become market-worthy. In addition, the system further reinforces a divide between an independent human versus dependent elders. So here I examine how WHO's proposal of active aging has found its way into the Chinese smart elder care, which seeks to engineer a senior identity characterized by independence and dignity. So that's the two signature keywords. This emphasis on self-sufficiency implicitly treats elders' embodied vulnerability as an undesirable condition to be resisted and rectified. Underlying its positive rhetoric is an aversion toward the limitation of the aging body. We can perhaps observe a similar aversion in the practical agenda of smart elder care, which aims to ensure minimal interference with elders' daily routines. Take the anti-fall vest as an example. Its primary design goal is to resemble regular clothing so that users can effortlessly blend in with others. However, by ignoring the inevitable material messiness of aging, smart elder care tends to erase the human-machine interfacing process that critical post-humanism regards as enriching to human experiences. In a word, the smart elder care system provides us with a superficial scenario of post-human aging, if not a fake one. By reinforcing the notion of humans based on usefulness and independence, it in effect scandalizes the erosion of agency inherent in aging. To imagine a more inclusive, unconditional notion of elder care, I propose that we turn to a model of post-humanist aging, one that fully recognized uselessness and dependence in old age as the basis to redefine what is human. My source of inspiration here mainly comes from Liu Cixin's novella, Supporting the Gods, published in 2005. So I know everyone is typically exhausted at this time of the day, no matter which time zone you are in. So I'll keep my textual analysis short and sweet. For those who haven't read the story, you only need to know a few points in Liu Cixin's work to make sense of my reading. In the novella, an elderly alien species known as the gods created life on Earth and are now seeking care from their human descendants. In exchange, they promise to share their advanced technologies with the young humans. This elder care contract echoes the premise of the Smart Elder Care Initiative, where elders' entitlement to care is hinged on their usefulness to the state and the market. Following this logic, the intergenerational exchange in the novella unfolds into intergenerational conflict, where the young humans realize that the gods' cognitive abilities have declined. These elders can no longer comprehend their own technologies, making their gift as useless as they are. However, Liu Cixin's work fundamentally pivots away from the logic of reality in the realm of human-machine interaction. In the smart elder care system, machines are designed to function as a highly predictable and stabilized force, aimed at creating equally predictable and stabilized elders. In contrast, the machines in the novella, originally designed by the gods to automate care, proves to be as vulnerable as the elders themselves. So they glitch, they age, they collapse, they resort to creating the humans as a backup system. And then they fail to control the humans' free will, which is a product of their own programming. In this symbiotic system between the old, the young, and the machines, no one can really monopolize independence and agency. And each actor's action sets off a cascade of unpredictable interventions from others. In my longer essay, I interpret this systematicity in light of Keren He's argument against the control theory of cybernetics and her advocacy for distributed agency in human-machine interaction. From this perspective, I redefine aging as a process in which the elders, including both gods and their machines, relinquish absolute control over their life trajectories and remain susceptible to the changes induced by one another. Building on this shared vulnerability, I also reframe technologies as the fellow stakeholders in their symbiotic relationship with the elderly gods. So what does it mean if we make technologies not as our infallible safeguards, but as our fellow stakeholders? My point is that this redefined human-machine relationship can prompt us to reconsider human-subhuman dynamics, including the intergenerational conflict between the young and the old. In the novella, the young humans perceive the gods' fancy technologies as well as the gods themselves only as tools. When these tools fail to provide utility, they are immediately discarded and reduced to detachable objects having nothing to do with their users. The same logic leads to the disdain for the elders once they are deemed useless for human development. However, if the young humans begin to take themselves as one link in the distributed agency, they would find themselves as equally vulnerable as the elders and their machines to the persistent contingency inherent in their interactions. In this light, the elders are no longer the transactional partners for the young in a care contract, where two discrete entities just exchange favors. Instead, they intersect with each other in their shared open-endedness. So now I will employ a few side stories in the narrative to demonstrate how an alternative relationship with technology can, in effect, lead to a new intergenerational dynamic. What this new human-machine relationship enables, as I said, is basically a change in how we treat the general other in our symbiotic assemblage. In the novella, the protagonist, the god, carries a portable device to communicate with his girlfriend, who is 20 billion light years away. Due to the vast distance between the two lovers, the device can only transmit messages with an enormous time lag, taking about 30 months to deliver one single glitched syllable from the girlfriend's voice. So instead of being a static, ready-made technological interface, the device here points to an ongoing process of technological interfacing. Here I use the verb form of the word to emphasize how human-machine interaction requires continuous and laborious tinkering, adjusting, and even transforming of both the user and the device. In this context, human technology interfacing also implies a new model of self-other dynamic, as epitomized in the god's relationship with his romantic partner. As the protagonist, God attentively waits for his lover's unfinished words in patience and anticipation, willing to listen to her words with the rest of his limited life. He also presents a fresh perspective toward the other that is open and responsive, devoid of egotism, hierarchy, and objectification. This attitude constitutes a sharp contrast with the patriarch of his host family, the character named Qiu Sheng's father. You might remember that the host family used to perceive technology as merely objectified tools that can usher in a communist society where leisure and consumption can replace work and labor. In a similar manner, Qiu Sheng's father also perceives his human others as the object of his domineering and conquering desire. For instance, when he fantasizes about how the gods' advanced technologies would enable prolonged life expectancy, he primarily just fixates on the possibility of his prolonged sexual performance. Male sexuality here is depicted as the pinnacle of the anthropocentric notion of agency that strives for full dominance over the external world. It is very different from the kind of non-dominant, non-hierarchical self-other relationship that the gods enable with both technology and with his romantic partner. So what does this renewed self-other relationship mean to the issues of elder care and intergenerational dynamic? For me, it first implies an openness to risks and precarity, especially in the context of seeking support. The elderly gods' interactions with the young humans initially turn out to be an epic failure. To end the escalating abuse by their host families, the gods plan to return to their spaceships to resume a vagabond lifestyle across the cosmos. Despite such unfortunate outcomes, however, the risky process of opening up to the other also initiates unexpected possibilities that can profoundly transform both the old and the young. It's no longer just a kind of one-dimensional relation of give and take between the caregiver and the care recipients. For the gods, living with their human descendants has reignited their passion for learning. At his departure from Earth, the protagonist god takes with him high school textbooks from his host family as a souvenir, with the hope of revisiting the fundamentals of science. But most importantly, the encounter between the old and the young further leads to a transformation in the human's perception of their own agency. Despite the soured relationship between the protagonist god and his host, their shared time together leaves a lasting impact on the human family, both emotionally and existentially. At the end of the story, as the host family gathers outdoors on a late fall night, the chilly breeze serves as a poignant reminder of the chilling isolation endured by the gods, now in outer space. Gazing up at the starry sky, they experience a kind of conscient moment of awe, which nonetheless suggests the formation of an anti-conscient perspective. Rather than observing the elderly gods from a detached position, they can now feel the chills under their skin as they precariously imagine the darkness and the frigidity in the older's journey ahead. In this moment, the young awaken to the vast interconnectedness of the cosmic assemblage as their sensorial experiences resonate with the state of the old. This shared vulnerability casts the humans not so much as the younger versions of the gods, but as their mirror image. As Qiu Sheng's father eventually grasps at the end of the novella, it is the time for the humans to reckon with their own elder care. The word time here does not suggest some future moment when it is the young humans' turn to grow old. It is the here and now of the distributed agency they are already sharing with the older within a symbiotic relationship. So I want to quickly wrap up my presentation by going back to the question I posted at the outset. Can technology save us from the challenges of the Gerontocene? You can see that at the end of Liu Cixin's narrative, elder care seems to be once again framed as a humanist issue, one that has to rely on younger generations to save the future. And some readers, including me when I first read the novella, would perhaps feel disappointed that Liu doesn't give technology a more essential position in elder care. But my point is, this is not a regression from post-humanism to humanism. If we were to evaluate post-human aging solely by the presence of technology, we would reinforce this human-machine divide and fall back into the very pitfall of exclusive humanism and anthropocentrism. I think a more proper way to reckon with care technologies is to approach them as vulnerable aging partners, as I learned from Liu Cixin's work. This perspective of human-machine interaction can enable us to envision a symbiotic system in which the old, the young, and the machine are relationally interdependent. In light of their shared susceptibility to this symbiotic system, machines are as vulnerable as humans, and the young are always already old. So ultimately and paradoxically, it is through this post-humanist perspective that we can imagine an elder care that is more genuinely humane. Thank you.